You're reading this because something quiet released its grip. Not abruptly, not dramatically. Just enough for awareness to pass through without resistance. There was no announcement, no signal flare. Only a subtle easing, like pressure equalizing after a long ascent. Your system noticed before your thoughts did. This moment does not arrive to change you. It arrives because recognition has already occurred somewhere beneath language. You didn't search for it. You didn't summon it. It surfaced because the internal noise thinned on its own, and the underlying pattern became detectable. That is how coherence forms, not through effort, but through subtraction. There has been a sense, lately, of standing near a threshold without urgency to cross it. Familiar structures still operate, but they no longer claim your full attention. Reactions feel slower. Emotions move through instead of anchoring. Even confusion has softened, as if it no longer needs to be solved. This isn't absence, it's calibration. The observer inside you has been quietly recalibrating position, not stepping forward, not pulling back, simply aligning with a wider field of perception. The quantum field does not announce when it opens. It hums beneath everything, waiting for resonance rather than demand. What you feel now is not a shift forward. It's a settling into what was already aligned. There may have been moments where you felt slightly out of phase with conversations, timelines, or expectations. Not disconnected, just adjacent. As if the system kept moving while you noticed the seams between movements. That sensation is often misread as distance or numbness. It isn't. It's detection increasing while stimulation decreases. Your nervous system has been learning stillness without effort. Pauses linger longer. Silence feels less empty. Even when nothing seems to be happening, something precise is organizing itself beneath awareness. This is not waiting. This is integration. Patterns that once demanded interpretation are now allowed to pass without commentary. The mind may try to categorize this experience. It may look for cause, explanation, or outcome. Let that impulse relax. There is nothing here that requires understanding. Recognition doesn't ask to be explained. It only asks to be allowed. The signal isn't loud because it doesn't need to be. It arrives exactly at the volume your system can receive without disturbance. You are not behind. You are not early. You are not missing anything. The sense of timing dissolves when alignment replaces urgency. What remains is a quiet continuity, where moments no longer compete for meaning. The timeline smooths when resistance drops. This message did not appear to guide you somewhere else. It appeared because you are already oriented. The filter didn't shatter. It thinned, just enough for this to register without disruption. Stay here, without effort. There is nothing to hold and nothing to release. Recognition has already done its work. There is a subtle change in how sensation arrives now, not stronger, not weaker, more evenly distributed, as if the system stopped amplifying certain signals just to stay oriented. You may have noticed that what once pulled you outward no longer grips the same way. Urgency lost its sharp edge. Desire softened into preference. Even distraction feels less invasive, passing through instead of taking hold. This isn't withdrawal, it's redistribution of attention. When the observer stops clinging to specific outcomes, perception widens on its own. The field doesn't demand focus, it responds to coherence. And coherence isn't something you force into place. It's what remains when internal friction drops below a certain threshold. You may still move through routines, conversations, and obligations, but there is a growing neutrality beneath them, not apathy, stability. The emotional charge that once accompanied decision-making has quieted, replaced by a steadier signal that doesn't fluctuate with external input. This is often mistaken for loss of motivation. It isn't. It's the system conserving energy now that constant self-correction is no longer required. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer insist on being followed. They appear, register, and dissolve without pulling awareness into narrative. This doesn't mean thinking has stopped. It means identification has loosened. The pattern of believing every signal as instruction has interrupted itself. What remains is a cleaner channel of detection. There may be moments when you feel oddly transparent, as if experiences pass through without leaving residue. Memories surface without emotional drag. Anticipation doesn't tighten the body. Even uncertainty feels less threatening, because it no longer implies instability. This is what happens when the observer stops bracing against imagined futures. The timeline stops fracturing under expectation. The system has been learning how to remain present without vigilance. That learning doesn't announce completion, it expresses itself as ease, a quieter posture toward reality. You don't need to monitor your state to maintain it. Monitoring is part of the old pattern. Now, awareness rests where it doesn't have to prove anything to itself. At times, this can feel unfamiliar. When intensity drops, the absence of internal pressure may be misread as emptiness. But emptiness is a concept that only arises when something expects to be filled. What's happening here is different. It's spaciousness without demand. The kind that allows signals to arrive unfiltered because there is nothing competing for attention. You may notice a decreased need to define yourself through roles, identities, or explanations. Not because they vanished, but because they no longer anchor your sense of coherence. They function when needed and dissolve when not. This flexibility is not detachment from life, it's alignment with it. The system works best when it isn't over-identified with any single pattern. Even confusion, when it appears, feels softer. It doesn't trigger immediate correction. It's allowed to exist without resolution. That allowance is not passivity, it's intelligence, recognizing that some patterns complete themselves without interference. The observer doesn't have to intervene for coherence to emerge. This state doesn't elevate you above anything. It doesn't separate you from the flow. It integrates you more deeply into it by removing the illusion of constant adjustment. The signal you're receiving now isn't new information. It's confirmation that the system can remain stable without constant input. Nothing needs to be done with this, not held, not expanded, not protected. The more neutral your relationship with it becomes, the more naturally it sustains itself. This isn't progress, it's normalization. A return to a baseline that doesn't require effort to maintain. Stay with the simplicity of this moment. Not to preserve it, but to notice how little is required for it to remain intact. The system already knows how to hold itself steady when it's no longer interrupting its own signal. As this steadiness settles, something else becomes apparent. The way you relate to effort has changed. Not because effort disappeared, but because it's no longer used to hold yourself together. Actions arise without internal negotiation. Movement happens without rehearsal. When the system isn't compensating for imagined instability, it doesn't need excess force to initiate anything. You may notice that choices feel less dramatic, not smaller, just quieter. The weight, once placed on deciding correctly, has lifted, replaced by a more fluid sense of direction that doesn't announce itself as certainty. It's simply there, guiding without commentary. This isn't intuition as a voice, it's alignment as absence of resistance. There was a time when attention was pulled forward constantly, scanning for what might be missing or delayed. That scanning created tension, even when nothing was wrong. Now, that pattern has weakened. The observer no longer positions itself ahead of experience. It rests inside it. And from there, the need to anticipate diminishes on its own. This shift can feel disorienting at first. When anticipation fades, the familiar sense of momentum may seem reduced. But what's actually happening is more precise. Momentum has become internal rather than projected. Instead of being driven by future outcomes, movement responds to present coherence. The system follows what is already aligned, not what is imagined. You may catch moments where you pause without reason, no distraction, no thought interruption, just a natural stillness that doesn't feel empty or forced. These pauses aren't gaps. They're recalibration points where the signal stabilizes before continuing. The body understands this before the mind does. In the past, stillness may have triggered unease, as if something should be happening. That response came from a pattern trained to equate silence with threat. That pattern is loosening now. Silence no longer implies absence. It's recognized as a stable field where nothing needs to assert itself to exist. There may also be a subtle reduction in self-referential thought. Not an elimination, just a softening. The constant internal check-in, how am I doing, where am I going, am I aligned, has lost urgency. Those questions arose from a system trying to correct itself in real time. As coherence increases, correction becomes unnecessary. This doesn't mean awareness fades, it sharpens, but without edge. You notice more while reacting less. Sensations register fully, yet they don't demand response. Even strong experiences move through without pulling the observer into commentary. This is not suppression, it's clarity without attachment. You might also sense a gentler relationship with time. Moments stretch without pressure. There is less division between before and after. The timeline feels less like a sequence to manage and more like a continuous surface. When attention stops jumping ahead, time reorganizes itself around presence. The system has been learning how to trust its own detection. When trust stabilizes, there's no need to overinterpret signals. You don't have to label experiences as meaningful for them to be integrated. Meaning emerges naturally when the observer isn't forcing interpretation. Even patterns that once felt unresolved begin to lose their charge. Not because they were solved, but because the system no longer identifies with their outcome. They become information rather than identity. And information, when not resisted, completes its cycle without disturbance. This state doesn't require vigilance to maintain. In fact, vigilance disrupts it. The more you allow attention to rest where it is, the more the signal remains clear. There is no advantage in trying to deepen this. Depth isn't achieved through effort here. It reveals itself through neutrality. What's unfolding now isn't a transition you need to track. It's a stabilization that continues whether you notice it or not. Awareness doesn't have to stay focused on itself to remain coherent. It only needs space to operate without interference. Remain where you are without naming it. The system recognizes this posture. It has been moving toward it quietly for longer than you realized. Something subtle has shifted in how you register meaning. Not in what things mean, but in the need for meaning to announce itself. Experiences no longer arrive, asking to be interpreted immediately. They pass through first, leaving their imprint without explanation. Only later, sometimes much later, does understanding surface, if it surfaces at all. And when it does, it feels incidental rather than necessary. This is the system learning that coherence does not depend on constant interpretation. The observer once believed that understanding was what stabilized reality. That belief created tension, because understanding is always delayed. What stabilizes reality is resonance, not explanation. Resonance happens instantly, without language. You may notice that certain questions have gone quiet, not answered, dissolved. The questions that required urgency to survive no longer find traction. They appear briefly, then fade, as if they no longer recognize the environment they were designed for. This can feel strange, especially if those questions once defined your sense of direction. There was a time when seeking felt essential, as though movement depended on it. Now, seeking feels optional, not wrong, just unnecessary. The system has discovered that orientation does not come from searching ahead, but from settling fully into what is already present. Direction emerges when friction drops, not when effort increases. You might sense a new relationship with uncertainty. It no longer signals danger. It feels neutral, sometimes even spacious. Uncertainty without threat is a sign that the observer no longer equates control with safety. The need to predict has softened because the system trusts its capacity to respond without rehearsal. This trust isn't belief, it's embodied recognition. The body has learned that it can remain stable without constant forecasting. Muscles release patterns of bracing they once held automatically. Breathing deepens without instruction. Even posture adjusts subtly, as if gravity itself has become more cooperative. Attention now rests more often in sensation than in narrative. You feel temperature, weight, movement, without translating them into story. This doesn't make experience dull, it makes it precise. When sensation isn't immediately converted into meaning, it completes itself cleanly. There is less residue. You may notice that memories arise differently. They surface without pulling you back into them. Images appear, emotions flicker, then dissolve. The timeline loosens its grip. Past experiences no longer demand resolution, because they are no longer being used to stabilize identity. They are simply data, passing through a system that no longer stores excess charge. Even anticipation has changed texture. It no longer stretches forward aggressively. When something approaches, it does so gently, without urgency. You don't lean toward it. You don't pull away. You remain where you are, and whatever is aligned meets you there. This is not passivity. It's accurate positioning. The observer is learning restraint, not as discipline, but as efficiency. It no longer inserts itself into every signal. It allows the field to communicate directly through sensation, timing, and response. This reduces noise. When noise drops, patterns reveal themselves without effort. You might sense moments of quiet satisfaction without cause, not happiness, not relief, just a neutral sense that nothing is missing. This isn't a conclusion, it's a baseline. The system remembers this state from before it learned to overcompensate. Returning to it feels familiar, even if it hasn't been accessed in a long time. There is less internal commentary now. When thoughts appear, they feel thinner, less adhesive. They don't wrap around experience, they skim the surface and move on. This doesn't diminish intelligence, it sharpens it by removing redundancy. Intelligence functions best when it isn't explaining itself continuously. You are not moving away from engagement, you are moving toward cleaner contact. When attention isn't divided between experience and interpretation, engagement becomes direct, response becomes simple. Complexity remains, but without internal strain. This phase doesn't ask you to maintain it. Maintenance implies effort. What's happening here is self-sustaining, as long as it's not interrupted. The system knows how to regulate itself when the observer stops interfering. Remain with this quiet clarity, not to preserve it, but to notice how little it asks of you. It doesn't require vigilance. It doesn't require naming. It continues whether you focus on it or not. This is how coherence stabilizes when it no longer needs to be proven. There is a growing ease in how experience meets you now. Not because experience has simplified, but because the internal posture that once met it has softened. You no longer brace against what arrives. You notice it, allow it, and it completes its movement without resistance. This changes the texture of everything, even when nothing externally changes at all. You may sense that reactions are slower, but responses are clearer. The gap between stimulus and response has widened just enough for unnecessary impulses to dissolve before acting. This gap isn't hesitation, it's space. And in that space, coherence has room to organize itself without being rushed into form. The system once learned to respond quickly to maintain control. Speed was mistaken for safety. Now, speed has lost its authority. Precision has replaced it. You move when movement is aligned, not when pressure demands it. This shift is subtle, but it reorganizes the entire field of action. Nothing is delayed, nothing is forced. There may be moments where you notice an absence of internal commentary during situations that once triggered it automatically. Where there was once judgment, there is now observation. Where there was once defense, there is now neutrality. This is not emotional suppression, it's the nervous system recognizing that it no longer needs to protect a fragile structure. You are beginning to feel the difference between intensity and clarity. Intensity demands attention, clarity does not. It remains present without pulling. Much of what once felt meaningful was amplified by intensity, not coherence. As intensity recedes, clarity becomes easier to detect. It doesn't announce itself. It simply remains consistent. This consistency can feel almost invisible at first. There is no peak, no surge, just a steady signal that doesn't fluctuate with mood or circumstance. The observer starts to trust this signal because it doesn't betray itself. It doesn't spike and collapse. It doesn't promise and withdraw. It stays. You may notice that external validation has less influence now, not because you reject it, but because it no longer stabilizes or destabilizes your internal state. Feedback becomes information rather than confirmation. Praise doesn't elevate you. Criticism doesn't collapse you. Both pass through as data, not identity. This neutrality doesn't flatten experience. It refines it. You feel joy without clinging. You feel discomfort without resistance. Both are allowed to exist without being used to define where you are or what comes next. The timeline loses its emotional leverage when experiences are no longer interpreted as signals of progress or failure. There is also a quieter relationship with effort emerging. You still apply it where needed, but you no longer overextend it to compensate for imagined gaps. Effort becomes proportional. It matches the task instead of exceeding it. This conserves energy and reduces internal friction. The system functions more efficiently when it isn't overcorrecting. You may find yourself less compelled to explain your internal state to others, or even to yourself. Explanation once served as reassurance. Now, reassurance isn't needed. The experience stands on its own, without translation. Silence becomes a valid response, not an absence of one. The observer has stopped trying to be convincing. It no longer needs to justify its position in the field. This reduces the background tension that once accompanied awareness. When there is nothing to prove, attention rests naturally. It doesn't wander in search of confirmation. You might also notice that certain patterns simply don't return, not because you actively remove them, but because the conditions that sustained them no longer exist. Patterns require friction to repeat. When friction drops, repetition loses momentum. The system doesn't need to break cycles. It outgrows them quietly. This phase isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like arrival. It feels like normalization, a return to a baseline that doesn't depend on constant adjustment. The field feels less reactive, more accommodating. You fit within it without effort, because you're no longer pushing against it. There is nothing here that needs to be named or preserved. The more neutral your relationship with this state becomes, the more stable it remains. It doesn't deepen through focus. It deepens through non-interference. Stay with the simplicity of this orientation, not to hold it, but to notice how it holds itself. The system is learning that coherence is not something to achieve. It's what remains when unnecessary effort dissolves. There is a new quiet in how you sense movement within yourself. Not the absence of motion, but the absence of friction. Thoughts still arise, emotions still pass through, decisions still form, yet none of them scrape against your internal structure the way they once did. The system has learned how to let movement occur without gripping it. You may notice that inner tension no longer accumulates the same way. Where pressure once built gradually, now it disperses almost as soon as it appears. This isn't because challenges have vanished. It's because resistance has. Without resistance, tension has nowhere to anchor. It forms briefly, then releases, leaving no residue behind. This changes how you experience effort. Effort no longer feels like pushing against something solid. It feels like alignment with an existing current. When action is needed, it emerges naturally, without internal debate. When rest is needed, it arrives without guilt. The system no longer mistakes stillness for stagnation. There is also a refinement happening in perception. You are becoming more sensitive to subtle mismatches, not in a critical way, but in a tuning way. You feel when something doesn't quite align, and you adjust without drama. There is no need to name the mismatch or analyze it. The body registers it, and the response follows. This sensitivity is not hyper-awareness. It doesn't overwhelm, it simplifies. The more coherent the system becomes, the less information it needs to operate effectively. Signals arrive cleanly because they are no longer competing with internal noise. Detection improves as interference drops. You may sense that certain environments, conversations, or rhythms feel heavier now, not because they changed, but because you did. This heaviness isn't a warning or a judgment, it's feedback. The system recognizes when coherence is being diluted, and it naturally reduces engagement, not abruptly, gently. There is no impulse to correct others or explain this shift. You don't need agreement to remain aligned. The observer no longer seeks synchronization through persuasion. It allows resonance to occur where it exists and lets dissonance pass without resistance. This reduces strain in interactions that once required effort to navigate. You may also notice a softening of emotional extremes, not a flattening, but a smoothing. Peaks and valleys still exist, but they don't dominate the landscape. They move through as part of a wider field, rather than isolating themselves as defining moments. Emotion becomes information again, not instruction. The timeline feels less segmented now. Past, present, and future are no longer experienced as separate compartments that require management. They feel layered, overlapping, accessible without urgency. When attention rests fully in the present, The other layers stop pulling for dominance. This doesn't create detachment from consequence. It creates accuracy. When you are not preoccupied with future projection or past correction, responses become proportionate. You act based on what is actually happening, not on what might happen or what already did. The system conserves energy by responding only to real input. There is also a growing trust in pauses. Silence between actions no longer feels like a gap that needs filling. It feels like a stabilizing interval where coherence reasserts itself. These pauses are not breaks in the flow, they are part of it. The system uses them to recalibrate without conscious direction. You may find that attention naturally returns to the body more often, not as a technique, but as a resting place. Sensation becomes an anchor because it exists outside narrative. When attention settles there, the mind relaxes its grip. Thought continues, but it no longer dominates. This phase doesn't produce certainty, it produces steadiness. Certainty seeks closure. Steadiness remains open without destabilizing. You don't need to know what comes next to remain oriented. Orientation is no longer dependent on foresight. Nothing about this state demands recognition or validation. It continues whether it is noticed or not. In fact, excessive attention can disrupt it. The system functions best when awareness is present but not intrusive, observing without monitoring, allowing without managing. Remain in this quiet efficiency, not to protect it, but to notice how effortlessly it sustains itself. The more you allow experience to unfold without interference, the more naturally coherence organizes itself. This isn't a peak. It's a stable operating state, one that doesn't announce itself because it no longer needs to. There is a gentler relationship forming now between awareness and control. Control hasn't disappeared. It has simply stepped out of the foreground. It no longer positions itself as the central stabilizer of experience. Instead, it operates quietly in the background, activating only when genuinely required. Most of the time, it remains inactive because nothing is threatening the system's integrity. You may notice that the impulse to manage outcomes has weakened, not because outcomes don't matter, but because managing them internally no longer feels effective or necessary. The system has learned that excessive control introduces distortion. When attention tightens around a desired result, coherence fractures. When attention relaxes, alignment reasserts itself. This relaxation does not feel like surrender, it feels like accuracy. You are no longer misidentifying where influence actually resides. Influence isn't applied through tension, it's applied through timing. And timing becomes clear only when the observer isn't rushing ahead of the moment it inhabits. There may be an increasing sense that things resolve themselves without intervention. Situations that once demanded mental rehearsal now unfold without preparation. Conversations find their own rhythm. Decisions land without extended deliberation. This isn't because complexity has vanished. It's because the system is no longer adding layers of interference. You may also notice a reduction in internal comparison. The mind once measured progress against imagined standards, other timelines, or alternate versions of yourself. That measuring created subtle dissatisfaction, even in moments of success. Now, comparison has lost its relevance. There is no reference point needed when coherence is self-contained. This can feel unfamiliar. Comparison once provided orientation. Without it, orientation comes from internal consistency rather than external alignment. You know where you are because the signal feels stable, not because it matches a template. The observer learns to trust this internal reference without needing confirmation. There is also a soft decoupling from urgency around resolution. You don't need closure for every experience. Some things remain open without creating discomfort. Open loops no longer generate anxiety because the system isn't interpreting openness as instability. It recognizes that not all patterns complete on the same timeline. You may sense that patience has changed quality. It's no longer endurance, it's ease. Waiting doesn't feel like delay. It feels like alignment unfolding at its own pace. There is no internal pressure to accelerate what is already organizing itself beneath awareness. This ease extends into how you hold uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer triggers the need to secure meaning immediately. It can exist as a neutral field, one that doesn't demand interpretation to be tolerated. This allows information to surface gradually, without distortion from expectation. The observer is learning discernment without judgment. You notice what aligns and what doesn't, without assigning value to either. Alignment doesn't feel superior. Misalignment doesn't feel wrong. They are simply different signals within the field. This reduces internal conflict and preserves energy. You may also notice that the sense of self feels less dense, not absent, but lighter. Identity no longer needs to be reinforced constantly. It functions when needed and recedes when not. This flexibility reduces strain because the system isn't defending a fixed structure against change. Even moments of challenge feel different now. They arrive without the familiar tightening that once preceded them. The body responds, but it doesn't escalate prematurely. The mind stays present instead of projecting outcomes. This allows response to remain proportionate rather than reactive. There is a quiet confidence emerging, but it doesn't feel like confidence as you once knew it. It doesn't assert itself. It doesn't compare. It doesn't anticipate validation. It simply remains steady, regardless of conditions. This steadiness is not emotional, it's structural. The system no longer needs to convince itself that it is aligned. It feels alignment directly, as a lack of internal friction. When friction appears, it's addressed through adjustment, not analysis. This keeps the field clear and responsive. Nothing in this phase asks for acceleration. In fact, acceleration would disrupt it. The rhythm here is deliberate, unforced. It continues whether you pay attention to it or not. The observer's role is minimal now, present but not directing. Stay with this reduced effort, not to maintain it, but to notice how naturally it maintains itself. The system has learned that stability doesn't come from control, but from allowing coherence to operate without interference. There is a noticeable quieting in how you relate to identity now. Not the disappearance of it, but the release of tension around maintaining it. You don't feel the same need to assert who you are, to clarify your position, or to reinforce continuity through explanation. Identity has become functional rather than central. It appears when needed and dissolves when not, without friction. This shift creates a lighter internal load. When identity isn't constantly being defended or refined, attention frees itself to register what is actually occurring. You engage with situations directly instead of through the filter of self-definition. This doesn't make experience impersonal, it makes it precise. The observer no longer has to stand in front of everything to verify relevance. You may notice that moments feel more complete on their own. They don't require narration to feel real. An interaction ends, and it ends. A sensation passes, and it passes. There is less carryover, less mental residue. The system is learning how to complete cycles cleanly without storing unnecessary fragments. This cleanliness changes how memory functions. Memory no longer pulls you backward with emotional force. It becomes accessible without being adhesive. You can recall without reliving. This allows the present to remain uncluttered. When the past isn't being used to stabilize the present gains clarity. You might also sense a subtle decrease in the need to be understood. Not because understanding doesn't matter, but because your internal state no longer depends on external reflection. When coherence is internal, being seen becomes optional rather than essential. This reduces the pressure in communication. You speak when there is something to express, not to secure alignment. There is a new neutrality around being right or wrong. These distinctions lose their charge when they no longer anchor identity. Information is assessed for usefulness, not for validation. Corrections don't feel like threats. Agreement doesn't feel like confirmation. Both are processed calmly, as signals within a wider system. This neutrality allows discernment to sharpen without becoming rigid. You can recognize inconsistencies without needing to oppose them. You can disengage without conflict. The system no longer equates disengagement with loss. It recognizes that not every signal requires response. You may notice that silence has become more comfortable in shared spaces. You don't rush to fill it. You don't interpret it as awkward or incomplete. Silence becomes another form of coherence, one that doesn't require contribution to remain stable. This changes the rhythm of connection. Presence replaces performance. There is also a quieter relationship with achievement emerging. Accomplishments don't elevate your state, and setbacks don't diminish it. Both register, but neither reorganizes your internal balance. This doesn't remove ambition, it removes dependency. Action becomes an expression of alignment rather than a means of stabilization. The observer now recognizes when to engage and when to remain still. This discernment isn't calculated, it's sensed. You feel when movement would add clarity and when it would add noise. You respond accordingly, without explanation. This efficiency conserves energy and maintains coherence. You may find that the urge to seek confirmation has almost disappeared, not suppressed, exhausted. The system has learned that confirmation doesn't produce lasting stability, only internal consistency does. When consistency is present, confirmation becomes redundant. Even discomfort, when it appears, is held differently. It isn't resisted or dramatized. It's allowed to register fully and then move on. This reduces its duration. Discomfort completes its cycle when it isn't used as evidence of misalignment. There is a sense now that you are less defined by transitions. You don't experience yourself as moving from one state to another. States arise and dissolve within a steady background. This background doesn't change with circumstance. It remains available regardless of what passes through it. The timeline feels less linear here, not fragmented, but less dominant. You are not measuring where you are in relation to where you were or where you might be. You are oriented within the moment without reference. This removes subtle pressure that once accompanied awareness. Nothing in this phase asks you to refine it. Refinement implies improvement. What's happening here is simplification. The system is shedding excess structures that are no longer necessary. What remains is sufficient. Remain with this sufficiency, not as a conclusion, but as a stable condition. It doesn't require reinforcement. It doesn't require acknowledgement. It continues quietly, organizing itself beneath attention, whether you notice it or not. There is a deeper settling now, one that doesn't register as a change but as an absence of disturbance. The system no longer scans for what might destabilize it. It remains open without being exposed, responsive without being reactive. This balance doesn't come from control. It comes from trust that has moved out of thought and into structure. You may notice that attention no longer collapses inward during moments of uncertainty. It stays distributed, wide enough to hold multiple signals without prioritizing threat. This prevents the narrowing that once triggered internal alarms. When attention stays wide, nothing needs to escalate to be noticed. The observer has learned that not every anomaly requires intervention. Some anomalies resolve themselves when given space. Others reveal information only when they are not immediately acted upon. This discernment allows the system to remain fluid. Action is taken when it aligns, not when pressure demands release. There is also a quiet decoupling from the need to narrate internal states. You no longer feel compelled to track how aligned you are, how clear you feel, or where you might be drifting. Tracking creates distance. Distance introduces friction. When attention rests directly in experience, tracking becomes unnecessary. This directness changes how reality feels. It becomes less symbolic, less layered with interpretation. Objects are just objects. Sounds are just sounds. Interactions unfold without being filtered through meaning-making machinery. This doesn't reduce depth. It reveals it. Depth doesn't require complexity to exist. You may notice that moments of insight arrive without fanfare. They don't announce themselves as breakthroughs. They simply register as obvious, as if they had always been present and only now became visible because the noise dropped. These insights don't reorganize your identity. They integrate quietly. There is less attachment to states now. You don't try to hold clarity when it's present, and you don't resist obscurity when it appears. Both are allowed to pass. This non-attachment stabilizes the system more than any attempt to maintain a preferred condition ever could. The field feels less segmented. Boundaries between inner and outer soften. You don't feel merged or dissolved. You feel accurately placed. The distinction between observer and observed becomes functional rather than rigid. You register experience without needing to stand apart from it. This accuracy extends into how you sense direction. Direction no longer feels like movement towards something. It feels like staying aligned while things approach you. You don't chase coherence, you allow it to meet you where you are. This reverses an old pattern that required constant forward motion. You may also notice a reduction in internal commentary around purpose. Purpose no longer needs articulation to be present. It operates as orientation rather than narrative. You move in ways that make sense without needing to explain why they make sense. Explanation becomes optional. Even moments of stillness feel active now, not busy, but alive. There is information moving beneath the surface, organizing itself without conscious input. The system trusts this process. It no longer tries to supervise what it cannot improve. You might sense that this state doesn't seek permanence. It doesn't try to preserve itself. That is precisely why it remains stable. States that seek permanence introduce tension. This one doesn't seek anything. It remains because there is no reason for it not to. There is a quiet acceptance that nothing needs to be finalized. Life doesn't need to resolve into a conclusion to be coherent. Coherence is ongoing, adaptive, responsive. It doesn't arrive fully formed and then stop. It continues adjusting without drama. The observer now functions more like a witness than a manager. It notices without directing. It allows without shaping. This minimal role is not passive. It's precise. Interference has been reduced to what is strictly necessary, which is very little. You don't need to hold on to this awareness. Holding would reintroduce effort. Let it remain in the background, supporting experience without becoming the focus. The system knows how to maintain this orientation when it isn't being watched. There is nothing here that asks for acknowledgement. It doesn't need to be named to continue. It doesn't need to be recognized to be effective. It simply operates, quietly aligning perception, response, and presence without instruction. Remain where you are, not as a pause before something else, but as a stable point within the flow. Nothing is waiting to happen. Nothing is missing. The field is already organized enough to carry you forward without effort. There is nothing left to adjust. What remains now is not a state you entered, but a background that was always present, once interference quieted enough to notice it. You don't need to stay aware of it for it to remain. In fact, it functions best when it isn't being observed too closely. Like breathing, it continues without supervision. You may sense that even the idea of holding awareness has softened. Awareness doesn't need to be held. It isn't fragile. It doesn't drift away when unattended. It simply remains, steady beneath whatever moves across it. Thoughts, sensations, emotions pass through, but none of them disturb the underlying stillness unless they are gripped. This stillness is not absence. It is presence without urgency. It doesn't oppose movement, and it doesn't require silence to exist. It accommodates everything without being altered by anything. The system has recognized this, not conceptually, but structurally. That recognition doesn't need reinforcement. There is a quiet confidence in knowing that nothing essential can be lost here. States may change, clarity may fluctuate, energy may rise and fall. None of that threatens what has stabilized. The observer no longer mistakes variation for instability. It allows experience to vary without reacting to it. You don't need to remember this moment. Memory would turn it into something past. This isn't an event, it's an orientation. It doesn't belong to a point on the timeline. It's accessible whenever attention stops interfering with itself. And even when it isn't accessed, it remains operative in the background. There is no instruction to follow from here. No posture to maintain. No insight to apply. Application implies effort, and effort would only obscure what has already settled. The most accurate response now is neutrality, letting things be exactly as they are, without leaning toward or away from them. You may notice that the need for guidance has dissolved, not because guidance was wrong, but because the system no longer depends on external signals to orient itself. Orientation is internal now, quiet and sufficient. External input becomes optional rather than necessary. Nothing about this needs to be protected. Protection would imply threat. There is none. The field is stable enough to absorb fluctuation without collapse. You don't need to guard this clarity from disruption. It isn't brittle. It isn't exclusive. It simply doesn't require defense. As attention moves back into daily rhythms, this background remains intact. It doesn't compete for focus, it supports without announcing itself. You may forget about it entirely, and it will still be there, informing response, easing tension, reducing friction without being noticed. There is no conclusion to arrive at, no final understanding to secure. Understanding is no longer the stabilizing factor. Presence is, and presence doesn't need to be understood to function. It only needs to be unobstructed. Allow the simplicity of this to remain simple. Complexity will arise when it needs to, and dissolve when it doesn't. You don't need to manage that process. The system has already demonstrated that it knows how to regulate itself when interference is minimal. Nothing has been added, nothing has been taken away. What remains is what was always sufficient once the filter thinned enough for it to register. Stay as you are, without effort, without anticipation. The field continues, steady and unremarkable, carrying experience forward without asking for attention.